But before getting underway as well, I wanted to give you a bit of background and context about me, because I'm an outsider, very much an outsider, or at most a fringe dweller in the area of English for academic purposes. So I'm not a teacher and I don't work in a formal education context. My background is in museums and galleries, okay, where I work a lot with writers and writing. So developing content for publications, exhibition websites, and the different kind of resources that museums and galleries produce in order to, I guess, connect public audiences with the collections, knowledge and resources that they have. So bridging that gap between the specialised discourses of various disciplinary fields and the everyday discourses of everyday life. So in that Bernsteinian sense, between the uncommon sense and the common. I think so very much kind of doing sort of like what you're doing in this, got this slide here, so very much in that sense of navigating that space between these two discursive domains, but probably more moving in the other direction, or whereas you guys I know are very much about supporting students moving into these the discursive practices of the different domains. I'm quite interested in actually doing that, or at least in I guess in opening up, giving them the abilities to flex in different ways. So seeing, I know it came up in a session last time, that there's not just one way of writing once you're in an academic field, which I think a lot of students come out from universities with there's one way, and particularly what I want to talk about today is a lot of the values around that. I've become particularly interested in the visual arts, as that's been, and I think still is for many, a field where language is particularly troublesome. Okay, so for many museum audiences, it's the art museums in terms of understanding and connecting with the texts that they encounter in art museums. I mean, also for students in being able to produce the text that brings them success in that field, and then, as I said, for professionals being able to flex their writing as the context and audience warrants. So in essence, I guess I'm kind of in this space of supporting and facilitating better communication between these three groups, audiences, students and professionals, by trying to build these strong two-way bridges across that space in between. And this endeavour actually drew me very much into wanting to understand the foundations of art writing practice. So really going back to the starting blocks and looking at what and how students learn to write about art in their formative school years, and what connections there might be or not be between what they learn at school in higher education and then in the field itself. So in other words, kind of how does what goes on in the classroom affect what goes up on gallery walls and into their websites and programs? So these were very much my motivating questions, but they do connect to some prominent and quite enduring issues within the visual arts and visual arts education. So issues around access and participation, issues a lot around the value of creative subjects within the curriculum, a hot one, particularly in Australia, where I'm from, and the nature of art discourse itself. I'm going to talk today about two elements of some research that I'm currently involved in. And so firstly was a small pilot study that I did in 2018-19, just before COVID, with Claire Robbins at the IOE in London. And we looked at, it involved a series of group and individual interviews with a small group of secondary art and design teachers, and then some discussions with some groups of students in their GCSE and A-level years. And then secondly, we did a literature review, a broader literature review, to kind of put a context in that around, looking sort of back to primary and forward to tertiary. So it's these two data sets, I suppose, I'm drawing from today. So in terms of the questions, the pilot we did with these were secondary teachers. We looked at what role does writing play in the secondary art and design classroom, and when we say writing, I mean language more broadly in terms of reading, listening, writing and speaking. What kinds of writing do students do? How is writing valued and assessed? What aspects do students and or teachers find difficult or problematic? What values and beliefs around art writing are evident among the students and teachers, and also in curriculum documents and resources? And were there any other questions around writing that actually mattered to them, okay, rather than to me? And so they were the questions that we put in. We sort of put in the pilot, and then also that we kind of really addressed in the literature review. But we looked at primary, secondary, and tertiary. It took a much broader picture. So just focusing now on writing in secondary art and design, and basically that it's a really, art and design is very much a practice-based subject. So there's really minimal writing involved in art and design until the A level. So up until then, they have to write annotations in their portfolio books. The annotations that are required, they're not optional, they're assessed at GCS level and A level. And then at A level, they then have to do this extended piece of writing that's 1,000 to 3,000 words that is accessible. And it's they have to kind of reflect on their own practice and connect their own practice into broader art historical and critical narratives. So it's quite a difficult piece of writing that's unlike anything that they would have done in other subjects or have done before. So that's the context, and I just want to jump now to just, I guess, some of the key findings that jumped out of this that I'm going to really spend the rest of today just talking through these points. So first of all, what came through really clearly was that that writing in art and design often struggles to find a productive and welcome role. Okay, there's a recurring and embedded pattern of negative values around writing that really seems to gel in secondary school and flows through to higher education, and I think even into practice. And I guess I'm kind of wanting to argue or to put to you this idea that I think these values kind of further complicate the relationship between art and writing and contributes to, particularly at the secondary level, a gap in pedagogy and resources, and I think actually in the tertiary level a kind of a reluctance of art and design students to take up sometimes the support that might be available to them. And also that there's not much about art and design in the broader EAP literature. Okay, so for the first one, so writing in art and design often struggles to find a productive and welcome role. So writing is very much seen to compete with art making. Okay, it's not a complement, it's in competition in terms of time. So writing steals time away from doing art, and also visually, spatially. So often writing, text is seen to compete with art on a page, on a wall, and sort of, it's in competition spatially and in terms of time. It's seen very much as separate to art making. There's art and there's writing, they're not integrated, and also as lacking authentic value. So writing tasks are required, are seen as formulaic, imposed by external bodies. So that's something that's like a box ticking to satisfy others, not because it has any inherent value. And so these are a couple of comments that sort of took that are typical of the comments that came from the teachers. So they were spending so much time writing because of an expectation. You had so little time to teach art anyway. It's ridiculous. It's very separate. There's the written element and there's the creative element, the making, and they don't seem to link. That's the norm of how we use language in my school, I'd say, to validate the actions they've taken. So they've made interesting work, but they're forced to annotate. We use language as the way to support them, but I think it's more for us trying to get grades by thinking the examiner wants to see these explanations. Okay, so this sense of the writing as competing as separate as imposed. I think that the second point, and probably this is the one I'm going to talk the most about, is this pattern of recurring and this recurring pattern of negative values around writing that really seems to gel. That's really strong. So, I mean, comments such as these, the antipathy felt for text-based activity among teachers and students, and an opposition to word and between word and image not found in other subject areas. This author was surprised how much resistance there still is to language, and in particular writing, in many secondary art classrooms. So these are comments from the literature review, not from the pilot. The challenges, and another author talks about the challenges of getting students to see that reading and writing do not exist in diametrical opposition to art making. Okay, so this sense of art as of writing as art's arch competitor comes through really strongly. I think what became really interesting looking at this literature was that even in studies that are presenting a really, like the case studies that are presenting a sort of a view or examples of writing as a really sort of integrated and valuable part of an art curriculum, they often sort of start with the negative. So there's this sense that, that they're kind of at once advocating writing while reinforcing this negative stereotype. So this quote here, these quotes come from case studies talking about these programs, art programs that they thought were really helpful writing programs. And so one author starts, "Today I begin, we won't be working with clay. Instead, we're going to work with some reading and writing. The groan grows. Why? This is an art class. This sucks. You're trying to torture us to death." So it's kind of an anecdote that in a sense the author's using to kind of, I suppose, align herself with that body of art teachers who think writing kind of sucks. And so it's sort of to sort of position herself as one of them, to give herself the credibility of being one of them. And then she goes on. And it's a similar here, writing across the curriculum, words that strike fear into the hearts of many teachers. My students balk at the idea of writing in the art room. You can almost hear the retort as their open, inquiring minds slam closed. Okay. So in this example, you can see how the idea of writing in an art classroom is kind of attached to this, like it's this kind of almost instinctive, natural kind of fear, this, strike fear, they balk. So it's this kind of negative, guttural, sort of process. And then that is then paired with the idea that you can almost hear their open, inquiring minds slam closed, so that the values around art, in the subject art around creativity and inquiry and stuff are actually, they're kind of closing off those values by even the mention of the word art. The mention of the word writing. And it's a pattern that occurs through the literature, and it creates this really powerful bond that kind of supercharges the idea of writing in the art room with negative value. And so an idea that I want to kind of, propose is that this sustained bonding between writing and negative value has come to function as a bonding icon or bondicon within arts education and pockets of practice. So I think it's an idea that it's a term coined by Marie Stenglen, where a thing or an idea or some kind of semiotic form is repeatedly charged up with axiology. And she says that the pairing becomes so habitual that over time the content meaning discharges, but the sentiment remains and strengthens. So we don't really know anymore what a particular thing stands for, maybe, or what it means, or what it represents, but it doesn't really matter. The bondicons come to embody the shared values around which communities rally and bind. So common examples are things like logos and places and rituals like the haka and songs and slogans and team colours, that kind of thing. Like I have no idea where red and white came from, but anyone that's wearing it is a supporter of the Sydney Swans. So to use Stenglen's words, bonding icons are emblems or powerfully evocative symbols of social belonging which have a strong potential for rallying. In response to their solidarity function, people can and do rally around these icons. So this study has actually made me think, is the idea of writing as, not art becomes so strong, it actually is sort of become a bondicon in the arts education community. And you can see that just to go back. I think those are really good examples of that working, because again, the fact that the author has chosen to really diss writing out as a way to kind of show herself as part of that community as a starting point to move on, I think really suggests that in fact this is kind of what's happening. It's a felt reaction, it's not just kind of accepted. Interestingly, at the same time as there's this this repeated tarnishing of the idea of writing, there is this burnishing of the idea of talking. So in the art classroom, talking is just, you know, it's enjoyable, exciting, it deepens thinking, it builds complexity and empathy, it's authentic, it's active, it's complex, it's all these wonderful things. And writing, of course, is actually, you know, the complete opposite. So writing is not the real business of art. Talking is essential, seen as essential in art education. It's really, I think, quite a relentless and powerful axiology. And when you drill down a bit more, you get to the really, I think, the real fundamental barrier, which is that writing's being positioned as not creative, okay? This sense that writing is standardised, it's structured, it's rigid, it's there, it's just not creative. And I think that came through in that one of the earlier comments, the one about the separation. There's writing, and she didn't say there's writing and there's making. She says there's writing and then there's the creative stuff. They don't link. So this sense that there's that writing is now representing everything that art isn't is really strong in the community. It's actually actively opposing key values of art in being uncreative. And this is this quote here is an interesting one from a study that was done with foundation students, and it was around looking at different ways of approaching an academic, a sort of a traditional essay. And so these authors talk about students who choose to remain on more stable and familiar ground adopt a practice of mimicry. You know, this kind of student ventriloquizes a practice voice, becomes inauthentic. They're learning a product of ritualised performance rather than integrated understanding. I mean, it's very intense kind of language around this idea of sort of like seen as accepted formats of writing. You know, there are of course exceptions. So the whole literature isn't this. And it was interesting that the exceptions that gave really positive and authentic representations of writing typically come from teachers and scholars outside the field of art. Okay, so you've got studies that are, for example, based in the art classroom but carried out by teachers with backgrounds in other areas. So, for example, someone who was a drama teacher but now is an art teacher and doing, you know, have different kinds of you know, studies that or sort of projects that she's carrying out with students. There's also, and also actually studies where there's art teachers in collaboration with a literacy or sort of EAP kind of person, and they're actually collaborating together, and the writing is a lot more positive. Projects where art teachers are enlisted into other subject areas. So, for example, you know, in a English class or a history class, they might be using a poem as a stimulus. A painting as a stimulus for a poem or something. And also, actually, in the primary years. So, when you look at the literature for the primary years, again, it's very positive. There's not that kind of burnishing and tarnishing. And perhaps again, teachers are not necessarily art specialists. They haven't studied art formally, and they teach across the curriculum. So they were typically where the exceptions to this burnishing and tarnishing kind of came from. So just then to move on to the other key findings, and I guess this sense that that certainly in the secondary years there's a real lack of pedagogy and resources to support writing. And if you look at, for example, the schemes of work or the things that, you know, resources that are provided by the exam boards, there's nothing. They give lists of technical words, but there's no kind of language work. And so these are a couple of comments from teachers from the pilot. Certainly where I work, we don't ever teach them what good art writing is because we don't look at it. I've developed some strategies over the years, but there's no guidance at all on how to teach this for me. So I just do it on how I know how to write an essay. So they're drawing on their own personal kind of experience and practice. There's no guidance. Interestingly, students really perceive this as well. So these were a couple of A-level students talking about, well, we've never been taught how. You have to go off instinct. So I'm not 100% sure what I write in my book is actually useful or actually will get any marks. Honestly, I just don't know. In most other subjects, you spend like 6 years learning how to word things, how to use grammar in a specific way, how to structure it. It's been like completely ingrained. But with art, it's all been practical up to now. So I just have no idea what it would consist of, a piece of writing that's like over 200 words. I mean, these are kids just heading into their A-levels with this 1 to 3,000 word essay hitting them out of the blue with no kind of lead up. And I guess as well too, the sense that when you get to the tertiary years, to what extent is this tarnishing, this value clash around writing contributing to, I guess, the relative paucity of art and design studies in the broader EAP literature and practice, and the reluctance of students to come and take up help that could be available to them. So that's, and I guess that's the question that I guess I'm really interested to put to you guys from your experience in this. So
what was the question again?
Oh, just to what extent that it's this clash of values, the fact that because it's interesting with EAP too, because so much of EAP is about providing, sort of scaffolds and explicit, and like art, in terms of this, what is creativity, it kind of really celebrates risk-taking and, and disruption and not following rules and all this kind of ambiguity. They're really celebrated in the arts. So the fact that that assistance or support with writing is seen as being it's about providing structures and frameworks. I had a discussion with a colleague just on Monday actually about using the term, and again this was drawing on some of like SFL and how you can get some tools to support students and looking more deeply at texts and having more flexible skills. And I think I used the term tools and toolkit, and it was like a red flag. Like, I hate the word toolkit. Like it's about then you've been given something, you don't have any agency in it, which of course is not the way I would have thought of it at all. But so I guess that's that question. Yeah, is how much there's a value clash, and then a need, to what extent there's a need to, how do we bridge that? How do we reframe then sort of EAP or sort of writing support, some kind of pedagogy and resources, so that they actually align with these values that are important in art, because that's the field. It's not so much, the knowledge and the skill, but it's the values around them and the way they're presented. Let's go next. I'll wrap up now, but just, a couple of other things that came through from the literature was some sort of strong patterns, was that the studies that were there very much reported on individual discrete projects or classroom activities. There wasn't sort of any kind of connection to staged curriculum outcomes. Extremely limited repertoire of text types and purposes. There was like reflective annotations. That's reflective, really, that's it. So there was nothing on, extended writing, and interestingly, nothing that kind of used talking as a scaffold to writing, that kind of bridged that gap. There was talking and there was writing, and again, this value divide that just cut them off. There was, little attention paid to really any kind of detailed mechanics of written language. And a near total absence of studies that actually looked at examples of student writing and what was going on in them. And I have, not really come across any so far. There are bits of student writing plonked in as illustrations almost, but not analysed in any way. What are they doing? What is, as that teacher said, like what makes good writing, successful writing in art? So that's to me the trap, that writing, writing's it's resisted and it's marginalised at a time when it's actually required and assessed, and it's increasingly important in many arts-related jobs as well. It's repeatedly associated with values that are deeply contrary to those important in the arts. And so it then relies on this kind of implicit or ad hoc pedagogy. There's a lack of resources, particularly at secondary school, a lack of engagement at the tertiary level, that then feeds into this, creates this cycle and reproduces this pattern that in turn really undermines, I think, a lot of the kind of the aspirations of access and inclusion that are really important in the arts. And so there's this, again, this tension between this idea that you know, that art or making subjects are in some ways a kind of a respite or a safe place away from the heavy demands of writing in other subjects, but still by completely ignoring the role that writing can play and needs to play in that, you're sort of, you know, it's counterproductive. You're subverting your own aspirations in a sense. And yeah, so in terms of where are we with that? I guess for me, so far, the work has kind of raised a lot more questions than certainly the answers for at the moment. But these are some of the ones that kind of really stood out for me. And I'm interested in your views on whether, you know, writing has become tarnished to the point of being a negative bondicon in the arts. And if yes, how do we actually break that cycle? So what kind of research can best contribute to and progress student outcomes around writing in subjects and not further kind of demonise it? How can we create better bridges between EAP and art and design? And how can art education better prepare students to become confident and, well, I don't know, effective and confident writers in their fields of practice? So yeah, that's where I'm at. So thank you for listening, and I would really love to listen to you now. Yeah.
Yeah. With some colleagues here, we work in art and design postgraduate.
Right.
And we've been doing a project about this, but using conversation and the dialogic nature of art and design, and how the dialogic reflection, discussion, all the talking, how that becomes part of the cycle that can be incorporated into the writing. And we use a process of inquiry so that it's an iterative process that every time they have to articulate something, they have to note it down, and you know, becomes part and parcel of the spoken element. And we know, and a lot of tutors use this, but not maybe explicitly. So we're trying to make it more explicit.
And I think in that process as well, there's a lot of mirroring of even just the stage of maybe dialogue with a partner, classmate, student, a reaction to a stimulus, and you're sharing it with your neighbour. But then that's mirrored into, okay, well, what if instead of talking to a partner, what if you read something that presented a different view on the same topic? That's not that different. You're still in dialogue, even though it's reading and writing. There's still the same feeling that can come out of it, of self-discovery. And so that's
it's the meta
really
language
useful.
that you use.
But it's drawing the parallels between those processes is not being so different. And talking to a partner not being so different as reacting to a stimulus.
And they're all part of the same iterative process. So if they read something, they also need to talk about it, and then they might note something down or annotate it, but that annotation can then become part of another process. So they might read it and annotate something, and then they might say, this has made me think of this in my work, and then I'm going to start talking about that and doing the same thing, talking about it, reflecting on it, and writing it down. So we found that quite helpful, that and it also helps the conversation with tutors, that all you're doing in your sessions, they're doing it, and but it may be little, and like you said, annotated bits of writing, but those could become part of their writing process.
Yeah, but it doesn't just happen automatically for lots of kids. So that's and so that's exactly what I'm saying. That kind of thing, like you don't see that in the literature. And again, maybe it's going on in classrooms. And this was a small pilot study. I think there are about 20 teachers in it. So I mean, it's that thing of if it is happening in that more explicit way, it's not visible, and teachers don't seem to be able to access that. And again, that sort of divide, like, so for I read a lot of these articles and they're kind of going, yes, they've got this stuff and they've been having these discussions and they've got sticky notes and then references, and you go, where's the next step? You kind of think there's this next step, but it's never actually there.
Do you think it's sometimes a lack of articulation or clear articulation of what a specific tutor wants from the students? I'll know it when I see it. Well,
Yeah.
does the student know exactly what's expected? I mean, it seems to be like there's a kind of conflict between allowing freedom of expression and there are certain expectations if you have a certain criteria that you're marking the student.
Yeah.
Right? And it seems like there's some kind of friction going on between the two. I don't want to, restrict someone's creativity, let's say, but I certainly have criteria, and if a student's not really aware.
They're not, and in fact, there's a student. There was a there are a couple actually of master's students that talking. I think one was called, who thrives and who survives in an art education. In this sense that if you're coming particularly from a different sort of kind of background, that you don't know already this kind of implicit sort of ways of writing and stuff that they're required, but it's really there isn't the feedback they get is really there's no constructive or actionable feedback in a sense, but the idea of ambiguity and the values that celebrate that and kind of celebrate that in other parts of art, it's so intense because in some ways, like the things the kind of pedagogy that they use with art itself actually has all the steps. Like they look at the elements and principles and they learn to deconstruct visual images and artworks, and they get some meta language and they get tools by the principles, look at tone, look at composition, blah blah blah. So it's actually mapping that exact same process onto language. They've got
this fear of the writing process, and so
it's just another meaning-making resource.
This idea that they think when they start writing something, they've got to write the final product immediately. You would do that in design. You would do sketches, and you would brainstorm ideas, and you would sketch. It's the same process.
And you look at what other artists do, and you look at examples of things. So the pedagogy is actually sitting right there, and in a sense, it's the perfect subject to actually have really strong multimodal kind of develop strong multimodal literacies across things. But there's this kind of block, and that's what I'm saying. I mean, it's this kind of the values that's now.
As well, because I know I've come across this with students myself who literally choose art and design because they are weak in writing, because they have this fear of writing, and they consider themselves to be not very good at it, or because they're dyslexia and so on. So that's something that they consider to be their weakness. It would be a bit like me not choosing maths. And so I think I've certainly seen students at a university level who come in and they've been surprised at how much writing they have to do, and it creates absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I've tried to do is to kind of remove the fear by doing sort of using free writing and just saying, don't think about the final product, just write, just to get them used to, just to take the fear away somehow. I think. Write about what you last designed, but just write freely, whatever comes into your head, just to take away that fear of the sort of product that's going to be assessed
but without any strategy. So that
anything they write with some kind of assessment.
So you're kind of helping them to find the on-ramp rather than just giving them a dead end, right? With you talking about getting them to talk about or something, you're kind of taking something that they're already familiar with or not so threatening, and then you're then transferring that, so it's kind of more gradual, right?
And also confidence. What you're saying, to record them and literally transcribe. We have tutorials when I'm madly typing what they're saying and saying, this is what you said. If you just separated it and maybe expanded on that a little bit more, then you would have a piece of writing.
I've got a really good friend who's a photographer. She's a photography lecturer and a photographer, and she's doing a PhD at the moment. But all of her writing she does like that. She speaks into a recorder, transcribes it, refines it, because she's dyslexic. She has difficulty with writing, and that's her process. And she's like, that's completely fascinating.
Which is great.
So professional.
So all the it's all the things that they're just there in this subject, but they're not being picked up. I've got a colleague who, a fellow. He's a poet actually, Mark Trednick. He is a poet and he does writing, sort of writing classes and stuff at university at home. But he talks about this idea of talking tidied, and he kind of makes that sort of link between talking and writing, but that writing has more structure, whatever it needs, this process. So you can't just a straight transcript isn't going to work. And I think it's interesting how when I kind of introduce that, because it's come from a poet, a kind of a creative perspective, and it is a really powerful. I think it's a really great analogy, right? That good writing is talking on paper, but it's talking tidied, is a really strong kind of thing. But how, so
and added to the iterative. You might talk about something, but you might need to find somebody else who or compare
a few different people.
Yeah, exactly. You might have said something about the way the folks from I'm not very good at talking about art, but they might have talked about something, but you need to get somebody else who's also talking about this, and so that not just tidying, but layering.
So practicing the conversation with different people and seeing how it changes each time you try to
and bringing in some of your writing, but talking about, even if you did it talking all the time, you could even listen to the text, give a response, and then talk through the response, but then that becomes notes, and that becomes another layer onto your original talking. I think they're separate things. There's the output of your language, and whether it's spoken or written, but also the way you develop that. Because we might develop it on a conversation outside, and we might continue it. But they.
Sorry, Sharon, I'm aware there isn't a chair as far as I can see, and you did have a question.
Thanks for your talk, Jennifer. It's really interesting. I really enjoyed listening to what you were saying as well. I just thought it's really important that we differentiate between the really useful process-led or exploratory approaches to writing that we find in tertiary arts education, and actually the stuff that's being presented primarily in the research here, which is the identification of problems with curriculum design in primary and secondary education, where the curriculums have been created by people who are not artists. And it seems to me that the students at that level smell the artificiality of the task. My children, when they're doing, so for example, my daughter had to do some work on Steve McQueen recently as part of Black History Month, and that involves writing where he went to college and the problems that he had at college in West London, and the fact that one of his films was inspired by Buster Keaton. There was no correlation with the type of writing that actually theorists or artists themselves might actually usefully do. So when I was seeing here about writing being tarnished, I feel like it's not writing, it's that type of writing. That kind of display task where they say, write down what you know and we can assess that because it's propositional knowledge. But at that level, there's no writing that's actually talking about responses to the art, or the type of thing that like an actual practitioner would be doing.
And there's also no sense of genre. It's not like anything you've seen before, and that always infuriates me with writing assignments, because it's like I've never seen that in reading, a blog online or a magazine or like anything. I've never seen any bit of writing that looks like what you'd have to produce. How are you supposed to do it if you've never seen it?
Why are they not looking at Gerhard Richter's writing about his own practice?
But I guess that, so I suppose that in a sense is what I'm kind of saying, is that you're saying that's what happens there because they're bad writing tasks, inauthentic writing tasks, but the emotion, that sort of value sticks, and it sticks more generally to writing. And so it's because teachers aren't doing that because they just think writing sucks, it's separate, we don't have to do it, it's stealing time away, it's not part of, they don't see it as integral. And it's not that maybe the genesis was, and I think again of this sense of the sort of the way writing's been imposed in art is still such a contested issue, that whole kind of Coldstream, whatever. But that's just kind of, that's blocking the whole process. I mean, there's just now this value that is sticking. And again, in a sense, what happens in secondary school, how much does that, it's a clean slate when you get to foundation year and stuff, in terms of perhaps knowledge and skills. But my sense, from talking to a lot of teachers and students and art professionals, is that these values, actually, it's not a clean slate with the values, because the values are sticking and the values are really gelling for them in secondary school, and they're not... and they're staying, and you see it flow right through to in practice. And so an interesting, as an interesting example of that was I did a study at the Whitechapel Gallery a couple of years ago, with looking at visitor sort of attitudes and sort of understandings of text, the role of text in art exhibitions. It was a little study. There was an exhibition that didn't actually have labels on the wall. They had a little booklet for various reasons, and it wasn't planned, but it became a really interesting thing because in the audience, the interviewees, there were. I asked, one of the questions sort of asked was, had you studied art? Have you studied art? Are you an art insider in a sense? Do you work in the arts? Because at the Whitechapel, a lot of visitors are actually artists and art teachers and whatever. And there was this really strong divide between the visitors who were inside the field of art, who really liked the